Welcome back to the second in a series of videos looking at how we can avoid habitual post-processing. How can we get out of autopilot? The series is called Second Look, and in this episode, we're looking at light and when in an image the light takes over or should take over and can help us create a much more powerful image, a more creative image than the outcomes from our standard processing workflows or using the auto functions within Lightroom, for example. This applies to all software, specifically going to be using Lightroom. So let's get into that and look at this image that we're going to look at today. This image is a landscape scene from the Overberg region of South Africa. And you can see that it's a long exposure in the top left there. It's a 4-second exposure, so clearly had an ND filter, probably a 6-stop, and shot at f11, low ISO at 64, and I shot that on my old 70-200mm lens at 82 mils. So first thing I'm going to do is just change the profile to Adobe Color, and then I'm going to take a snapshot of that image, call that raw, and that's our base image for all of the edits that we're going to do today. And to start with, we're going to do the standard automated functions that many people use in Lightroom, and that takes one of two forms normally. The first form is to select a automatic white balance. In this case, that cools the image down quite considerably and has introduced some magenta by the looks of things. And then for the basic panel, to select the automatic function again. And that gives you a base automatically edited image. And we'll call that snapshot auto. And moving back to the raw, the second way that many people are utilizing the functionality in Lightroom to very quickly edit an image, and this has only been recently available, is within the profiles, and that's the profile called Adaptive Color. Now, as I mentioned in the last video, it's not a profile that I like to use, and the main reason is that when you select that, you'll see that it doesn't affect any of your sliders in your control panels. And that means you're flying blind a little bit. You're not really sure exactly what's been done. This, for me, is the most similar to a JPEG image, a straight out of camera JPEG image. But that's another way of very quickly editing an image in an automated way. And we'll call that snapshot adaptive. And then we get to manual editing. We'll flip back to the raw image, start from the same place. And many of us get into a habitual state when it comes to our manual edits. We end up moving the same sliders in the same direction. I'm going to take on that persona and do a pretty much a autopilot edit. And I do find myself getting into this routine sometimes and need to snap out of it. But the automated edit in this scenario, you would select the white balance picker, select a fairly neutral area, and that's brought down the temperature a little. And then we would reduce the highlights, increase the shadows, bring the shadows up, I should say, not increase them. And then we're told that we should depress our Option key or our Control key on a Windows machine and maximize our dynamic range by moving the whites as far to the right as possible with the Option or Control key down, and our blacks as far to the left as possible. And that maximizes the dynamic range. Now, even if I was on autopilot, I can't fail but to see that the sky is overexposed. So even on autopilot, I would add a mask here. I would select the sky. I would probably intersect that with a linear gradient so that we don't get the really harsh edge against the mountains in the background. And then I would reduce the exposure, probably to about there. And then my final autopilot move would be to increase the vibrance a little, bring the saturation down a touch to compensate. And that would be my standard edit. That's a reasonable image, but not very punchy exactly. But we'll call that snapshot standard. Now, as I said at the beginning, today's video, we're focusing on light. And my recollection of taking this shot was all about the light and the way it was hitting the mountains and the way it was hitting the midground and even the foreground to an extent. So I'm going to go back to the raw file. And the way I see this image is in 3 parts. There are 3 very distinct elements for me. One is the sky, which I've overexposed. And that's often the case. My calculations sometimes on long exposure are not quite right. So I try to expose for the sky. But in this case, 4-second exposure, I've not quite got that right. So I'm overexposed on the sky. Then the second component is that mountain range in the background, very distinct from the rest of the image. And the third component is the midground and foreground. Not that there's much foreground, but mainly midground, but 3 very distinct elements. So I'm going to attack those 3 elements separately, and I'm not going to make any global adjustments here. So the first area I'm going to look at is this mountain range, and I'm going to use a mask, the Object Select mask. Make sure my rectangular picker selector is selected, and I'm going to select that mountain range, and hopefully Adobe will do a reasonable job of knowing what I'm after. Okay, it's taken some of the sky with it, and it's left some of this. So I'll add to that. Use a brush, make sure my flow is at 100%. Yes, it is. I don't need to be too careful with this selection because in just a moment, I'm going to subtract the sky anyway. So there we have it. And then we are going to subtract the sky from that selection, and that gives me a good selection. For those mountain ranges, I'm going to go straight into the effects panel, and I want to increase the dehaze about 17, 18, 19. That's fine. Increase the clarity a little, 12, and then we'll just bring the texture up a touch. It is a long way away, so we don't want to overdo that. That's absolutely fine. The second area we're going to look at is the sky, so we'll do a sky selection. Very clean selection in this case, but I'm still going to intercept that with a linear gradient to avoid the harsh join. And I'm going to be quite dramatic with my exposure. I'm going to bring that down by nearly 1.5 stops, I think. Yeah, 1.3, 1.3. Yeah, that's fine. Bring my highlights down a touch and bring my blacks down. Not too much. That's fine. Doesn't look terribly natural right now. Bear with me. So now we look at the third component of the image, and that's the foreground midground area. And we're going to add a linear gradient. And we're going to raise the exposure a little, at 1/2 stop, just over. That's fine. I'm going to boost the contrast quite significantly. Starting to emphasize the light that's hitting the fields here. And to further that, I'm going to increase the highlights to about 45, something like that. That's fine. And now for the big reveal. We're going to convert this image to black and white. And we'll add a tone curve to really accentuate contrast. Really want to push that contrast quite considerably. So as you'll know, that's a S curve normally. It's going to soften the edges down, and the same for the blacks. Let's push the contrast quite nicely. We look at the before and then the after. It's really giving a boost of contrast to the overall image. Now the light is coming from the top right of the image. So I'm going to start to accentuate that by adding another mask, a linear gradient coming down from the left-hand side. And I'm really going to darken that up quite considerably. I'm going to bring the exposure down by 1/2 stop or so. And I'm also going to bring the blacks down by a significant amount. And now the game changer for the image. We're going to add a radial gradient right across this image, fairly narrow but long. And I'm going to add a second radial gradient, similar shape and size, but at an angle across these fields. Let's go back to the first, just adjust that a little. Just going across those mountains. And then I'm going to increase the exposure by half a stop. And then the source of that fantastic light coming into the image, another radial gradient, maximize the feather and move that across so it's just outside of the shot. And then we'll extend that, replicate the shape, and then we'll go into our effects panel and we'll add some considerable dehaze, maybe a touch more. I think that works nicely. Now you'll see up in this corner here, just increase the size so you can see this. There's a nasty black corner. So I'm just going to add a very quick linear gradient and increase the exposure just to feather that out. And the before and the after, yeah, much better. Two final adjustments. I'm going to add a radial gradient to make a vignette. Going to be a large mask. And I want to move that up. We'll invert that. And we'll bring the exposure down by about a quarter of a stop, or maybe just more. Quite like that. Now I'm just going to look for dust spots. So there's one here. We'll clone that out. One there. Not too bad. But I do not like these clouds here. They are distracting for me. So I'm going to also clone those clouds, which some of the purists won't like. But for me, they were distracting. And that's the final image. So we now have 5 images to compare. We have the raw file, which didn't really look as if it was that promising, didn't really have that much potential. And then when we use the automated white balance and auto on the basic panel, we get a much more cool image, quite a lot of magenta in there, and don't particularly like that version. Then we use the adaptive color, which takes away that tint. In fact, I think could probably do with a little bit more magenta. Anyway, that's the adaptive color version. And then we go into our autopilot standard edit, which is definitely an improvement. Again, I think there's a little bit too much green in there and I might want to increase the magenta a touch. But that's the standard edit when we're not really putting a huge amount of thought into the process. We're really following habits and routines. Certainly from my case, I find myself doing that much more than I'd like to. So I really need to make a conscious effort to snap out of that. And when you do that, and in this case, you really think about the light in the image and you recall how the scene presented itself when you were there with your camera, then you can get much more creative. And I think this image really works in black and white. I think that emphasis on the light rather than color really works for this image. But let me know what you think. I'd love to get your thoughts, so drop me a comment in the section below. I read every single one of them and I respond to as many as I possibly can. This is the second in the series. In the next episode, we'll be looking at when colour is the hero of the image and how we can emphasize which colours when and why. Please join me for the next episode. Click subscribe to be notified and make sure you don't miss that when it's released. I look forward to seeing you then. In the meantime, please take care. Bye-bye.